So today we're diving into a really central question within Islam, one that's sparked a lot of debate, and we're going to explore it through the arguments of author Joseph A. Islam. The big question is this: does the Quran itself claim to be the one and only source of divine guidance for Muslims? At the very heart of this is a question that shapes the faith of more than 1 billion people worldwide. Where do you turn for God's path? Now, the answer might seem simple at first glance, but as we're about to see, the details are right at the center of a pretty significant theological discussion. So, you've basically got two main camps here. On one side, you have the common understanding that guidance comes from the Quran, but it's also supplemented by other really important religious texts. But then, there's this other view we're exploring today, the argument that the Quran itself insists that it is the only source you need. And that right there is the core of the debate. Okay, so before we can really get into the Quran alone argument, we have to understand what it's pushing back against. Let's first break down the more common majority perspective. All right, so the mainstream thinking goes something like this. The Quran is, of course, the primary source, but it's not the only one. The belief is that you need other collections of traditions and sayings to really get the full picture and practice the faith properly. And a key example of this, a really important one, is a special category of sayings known as hadith Qudsi. So what are these exactly? Well, hadith Qudsi, or secret sayings, are seen as totally unique. The idea is that even though they come to us through the Prophet Muhammad, the words themselves come directly from God, but they exist outside of the Quranic revelation. And this concept is absolutely central to that common viewpoint. And now, let's flip the coin and get to the core of the argument we're examining. The claim here is that you don't actually need to look outside the Quran for an answer to this question, because the Quran itself steps in and tells you whether other sources are necessary. The claim is, well, pretty bold. It says that the Quran actively pushes believers away from seeking guidance in any other hadith, any other statement. And the evidence for this, according to the author, doesn't come from somewhere else. It comes from the Quran's own words. And this is where the entire argument really hinges on one single crucial word, hadith. Now, today when you hear that word, you almost always think of the collected sayings of the Prophet. But the author points out that right here in the Quran itself, the word is just being used in its original general sense. It just means a statement or a narrative. And this verse really brings that point home. It's asking this powerful rhetorical question. Okay, you've got God's verses right here. So what other statement, what other hadith are you going to believe in? The implication is pretty clear. Nothing else should be necessary. All right, let's move on to the next pillar of this argument, which focuses on the role of the Prophet Muhammad himself. According to the Quran, what was his actual job description? What was his mission? So the idea here is that the Quran lays out a very specific role for the Prophet. He wasn't a creator of new religious laws or teachings, but rather the number one follower of the revelation he was receiving from God. I mean, look at this verse. It's presented as a direct command. The Prophet is told point blank to declare that he follows only what is revealed to him. The point being made is that his role is to be the messenger, not a co-source of the message. And this same idea gets reinforced again and again. Here, the Prophet's mission is defined by two things: follow the revelation and be a clear warner to the people. The argument is that there's just nothing else mentioned, no secondary stream of divine guidance that he's supposed to create. So, from the Prophet's role, the argument now shifts focus to the nature of the Quranic text itself. How does the Quran actually describe its own level of detail? Does it see itself as complete? And this is a really critical piece of the puzzle. The author's logic is this: if a book claims, in its own pages, that it's complete and fully detailed, well, that inherently challenges the idea that you need other books to explain it or finish it. The key word here is mufassalan, which means explained in detail or fully articulated. The verse is basically asking, why would you go looking for another judge or another source of law when God has already sent you this book that explains everything in detail? And this phrase, it gets even more direct. The author points to tibyana likule shayin, a clarification of everything, as one of the strongest internal proofs for the Quran's completeness. The question then becomes, if it clarifies everything, what's left for other texts to clarify? Okay, now we get to the final part of the argument, and maybe the most dramatic one. What does the Quran say are the consequences for anyone at all, who might add to or invent God's message? This is where the stakes get incredibly high. The author shows that the warnings in the Quran about keeping the scripture pure are so serious, they are directed squarely at the prophet himself. This isn't just a warning for regular believers, it's a line in the sand for the messenger. And wow, these verses, they are graphic. I mean, they describe this swift, severe, and unstoppable punishment that God says would happen to the prophet himself if he ever invented even one saying and tried to pass it off as divine. The author uses this powerful imagery to argue just how absolute the revelation-only principle is meant to be. So to bring this all home, the argument turns to the Quran's description of the Day of Judgment. The logic is, if other sources of guidance were just as essential, then surely the prophet's big complaint on that final day would mention them, right? But it doesn't. According to this verse, the prophet's one great complaint, his one great sorrow, is that his people abandoned this Quran. The argument is that this singular focus is the ultimate proof. The final judgment rests on the community's relationship with the Quran and the Quran alone. And so, after looking at all this internal evidence from the Quran itself, the argument leaves us with one last really provocative question to think about. If a text claims to be complete, fully detailed, and the sole source of guidance, what does that imply for everything that comes after it?